by entertainment journalists Tom Shales and James Andrew Miller. And rounding out the list is basketball's Charles Barkley with I May Be Wrong, But I Doubt It. For more information on the books on this list, visit the New York Times website at nytimes.com and click on Books. Is Islam compatible with liberal democracy? Is Islam tolerant of non-Muslims? These are two of the questions considered in Robert Spencer's new book, Islam Unveiled. Mr. Spencer spoke recently at Quail Ridge Books in Raleigh, North Carolina, for about an hour and 10 minutes.
It is our pleasure to have Robert Spencer back in the Triangle with us again. He spent his college years just down the highway from us at Carolina, graduating Phi Beta Kappa with highest honors in 1983. He continued at UNC and received his Master's of Arts degree from the Department of Religion in 1986. He has taught classical literature, history, religion, music, drama, Latin, Greek, Spanish, forensics, and softball. I hope not at the same time. First at Aquinas High School and then at Preston High School, both in the Bronx, and then at Colby Academy in Napa, California. While at Colby, he published the booklet Classical Education in the Contemporary World. Since July of 2002, he has been the Assistant Director of Religious Education for the Melkite Greek Catholic Diocese of Newton, headquartered in Newton, Massachusetts. He also serves on the board of the Christian Islamic Forum in Burke, Virginia, and as an adjunct fellow for the Free Congress Foundation in Washington, D.C. He is a copywriter for Eagle Book Clubs and editor of the Homeschool Bulletin of the Conservative Book Club, both in Washington, D.C. He has published hundreds of music reviews. For 4 years, he wrote for the website allaboutjazz.com, and since 1998 has been the music reviewer for Cadence magazine. His book, Islam Unveiled, Disturbing Questions About the World's Fastest Growing Faith, was recently published by Encounter Books, which is part of the nonprofit corporation Encounter for Culture and Education, Inc. The Reverend Richard John Newhouse, author of The Naked Public Square, said of the book, "This is a bracing argument that can help Americans think through what might well turn out to be the greatest religious, cultural, and political conflict of the century." Some of us have come to our interest in the Islamic faith by force through the terrifying attacks on September 11, 2001. Scholars like Robert Spencer, who has been studying the religion for 20 years, have much to offer to our understanding of Islam. Ray Olson, writing about his book in Booklist, calls it alarmingly cogent. Daniel Ali, who is the founder and president of the Christian Islamic Forum, says it is, quote, the first successful attempt at revealing this matter, unquote, of what Muslims believe. Many troubling questions have invaded our minds in the days and months following September 11th. Robert Spencer is here to discuss some of the answers. Please help me welcome him to Quail Ridge Books.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. This is a very important issue, as I don't need to tell you, and one about which there's significant high emotions, significant misinformation, and significant distortion. And that's those are some of the main reasons why I wrote Islam Unveiled. People in the United States, whether they're Christians or not, generally tend to think of religion in terms of Christianity, so that they think that it is something that is an individual's faith and an individual matter, something that's between an individual and God, and that it has only a secondary connection to public issues, such that we can put aside our sectarian differences and meet in the public square with various assumptions about tolerance and secularism in place. However, it is perhaps egocentric or culturocentric to assume that those kinds of assumptions carry over into the Islamic world. Also, we've heard a great deal about that Islam is a religion of peace. The president has said it, and many other people have said that Osama bin Laden and the terrorists have hijacked Islam. On the other hand, if you read what Osama bin Laden and the terrorists say, they base all their actions very firmly on Islamic religious arguments. So that at least raises a question whether or not their use of the Islamic material is legitimate. It raises a question that we need to consider as a nation in dealing with the threat of terrorism, the threat from Al-Qaeda or from anyone else, as to whether we can really safely import the Christian categories into an understanding of Islam and say that it is something that will fit easily into the secular framework of the United States government or of democratic polities in general, or whether maybe that would be a trifle naive to say. There was some good news recently in regard to the sniper, the member of the Nation of Islam who was shooting the people in the Washington area. Minister Louis Farrakhan of the Nation of Islam said that if he was convicted, he would be expelled from the group, and that there was nothing in the Nation of Islam, as strident and belligerent as it is about some matters, that would condone what he did. Now, that's very good news that Minister Farrakhan would say that. Unfortunately, when you look at the larger world of traditional Islam, it's not so easy to find somebody like that to say Osama bin Laden was wrong and what he did was outside the pale of Islam, and therefore we will, in some sense, excommunicate him or expel him or censure him. I mean, obviously you have many Muslims who did say that and are saying that today. The problem is that there's no central authority in Islam. There's no one person who speaks for Islam the way Minister Farrakhan can speak for the Nation of Islam. And so there's not one single voice. We all wish that the extremist elements in Islam were as marginalized and as small as the media suggests. However, there are very disquieting signs that this may not be the case. And it's not just gloom and doom to point it out, but it's merely good common sense, because after all, if we're going to be in this war on terror, the more we know about our opponent, the better able we'll be to respond to the threat. Now, in fact, there is no real firewall, if you look at the Islamic world, between moderate and extremist elements. In other words, you get the impression, if you read some people's books, not mine, but if you read some people's books, you get the impression that there's Islam, which is the religion of 1 billion people, and it is a peaceful thing. And then there are the extremists over here who are like kooks on the street corner who are raving and have hijacked the thing, and they happen to get a little money and power, and so they were able to knock down the Trade Center, but really they're on the fringes. However, in reality, there's nothing like the equivalent of the Baptist church on one street and the Catholic church on the other, and they go their own way and they don't have a whole lot to do with each other unless there's an interfaith supper. Actually, there's not a moderate mosque on one street and the extremist mosque on the next block, and they don't have a whole lot to do with each other. They are all mixed up together in the Islamic world. And this is what I will give you examples of. The moderate Muslims have yet to formulate, moreover, a clear and coherent alternate vision of Islam and the Quran that is free of violence. Because the Quran is full of verses which many people will say, well, you can take those a lot of ways, and of course you can take them a lot of ways. But the problem is that the terrorists do take them in a violent way, and the moderates have yet to respond, not to convince Westerners, that's easy, to convince Westerners that Islam is a religion of peace, but the moderates have yet to convince the extremist Muslims, or to even formulate a convincing argument for their co-religionists, that their use of these verses is illegitimate. Verses like this: Prophet, make war on the unbelievers and the hypocrites, and deal rigorously with them. Hell shall be their home, and evil fate. The true believers fight for the cause of Allah, but the infidels fight for the devil. Fight, then, against the friends of Satan. When you meet the unbelievers in the battlefield, strike off their heads, and when you have laid them low, bind your captives firmly. Slay the idolaters wherever you find them, arrest them, besiege them, lie in ambush everywhere for them. If they repent and take to prayer and render the alms levy, that's the jizya, which is a special higher tax on non-Muslims that's in Islamic law, that if you're a non-Muslim living in Islamic society, you pay a higher tax rate than the Muslims. And that's the classic law. It's not enforced everywhere in the Islamic world, but wherever there's a call to enforce the Sharia, the Islamic law, then you have calls for the jizya. In any case, if they pay this, allow them to go their way. Fight for the sake of Allah those who fight against you, but do not attack them first. Now that's the basis for, that's the reason why Osama bin Laden is very careful when he speaks in Arabic to the Islamic world to frame his arguments in a defensive context. He says, we are defending ourselves against people who are attacking the Holy Land, the infidel armies who are occupying the Islamic Holy Land of Saudi Arabia, and so on. And what we did was an act of defense, because this is what the verse says. But it goes on to say, slay them wherever you find them, drive them out of the places from which they drove you. Idolatry is worse than carnage. Now, there are many, many others. Fight against such of those to whom the scriptures were given as believe neither in Allah nor the last day. The people to whom the scriptures were given but who believe neither in Allah nor the last day are the Jews and the Christians, who do not forbid what God and his apostle have forbidden and do not embrace the true faith until they pay tribute, the jizya, again, out of hand, and are utterly subdued. Now, these verses coexist in the Quran with a good many verses, actually fewer, but they certainly are there, that are teaching peace and so on. You've probably heard them. If you kill one innocent person, it's as if you've killed the whole human race. And if you're merciful to one innocent person, it's as if you're merciful to the whole human race, and so on. The dichotomy is generally resolved, and again I say generally, no one person speaks for the Islamic world, and I'm certainly not pretending to. I've come here to give you some insight into what Muslims themselves are saying, not to really to say anything myself at all. But the dichotomy is generally resolved by a recourse to this verse from the Quran. Muhammad is the apostle of Allah. Those who follow him are merciful to one another, but ruthless to unbelievers. And this is a fundamental distinction that runs through the entire Quran, that the believers, one, should be loving and kind and merciful and gentle toward, but unbelievers have no such claim on mercy. And there is tremendous descriptions of hell and all the things that await the unbelievers, and long descriptions of their perversity and their guilt before God and why God has cursed them. And these verses are the reason why, for example, the ambassador to the United Nations from the Islamic Republic of Iran a few years ago said the concept of human rights, that is the idea that all human beings are equal in dignity before God, the concept of human rights is a Judeo-Christian idea and is alien to Islam. Once again, not my words, but the words of the Islamic Republic of Iran's ambassador to the United Nations. As a result of the existence of verses like this, it's very easy for the extremists to exploit them for their own purposes, however they might be legitimately interpreted. And a lot of people, just by the fact of my quoting them, have said to me over the course of the last couple of months, "You're quoting these out of context." Well, all right, but once again, I'm not claiming to be giving you any kind of authoritative interpretation of it. The problem is that if I'm quoting them out of context, so are millions of Muslims. And the moderates who would say, well, they don't actually refer to something meaning that you should kill people, have yet to, once again, have yet to formulate an argument that would convince the extremists that they are misusing the verses or taking them out of context. See, the Quran is so central in Islam. The idea is it's an eternal book that has existed forever with God in heaven and was dictated by God through the angel Gabriel to the Prophet Muhammad, piece by piece, until he had the entire copy of this eternal and perfect book. And so you have a book like that. That's greater than the Jewish and Christian idea of the inspiration of the Bible, that God would guide and speak through human authors, because this is the actual words that God himself is dictating. And it's so central, you see, that they can quote, the extremists can quote these verses very easily and make a convincing argument to, as they are doing all over, to millions of young people, that it is part of your Islamic responsibility to go out with us and kill these people. And they're convincing, because on the face of it, that's what the verses seem to be saying. Not only that, I will give you some examples of exactly this happening from the Islamic world. These are from a very informative, wonderful group that I highly recommend you all look into their website, MEMRI, MEMRI.org. The Middle East Media Research Institute performs an extraordinarily valuable service in translating material from the Arabic press into English. For example, this from the Arabic language daily Al-Sharq Al-Awsat from London. an interview with Nidal, who was the mother of one of the suicide bombers, Muhammad Farhat. And see, in wartime, all you have to do is look at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and you see, in wartime, a lot of things happen that are difficult to justify ethically according to one's own standards. However, it's a different case in this matter because you have exactly the justification coming from their ethical standards. This lady says, jihad is a religious commandment imposed upon us. We must instill the idea in our sons' souls all the time. What we see every day, massacres, destruction, bombing of homes, and there's no doubt about that. There's no doubt that these people are suffering tremendous injustices. Strengthened in the souls of my sons, especially Muhammad, the love of jihad and martyrdom. Then the interviewer asked, did you have a role in planting this spirit in Muhammad? She says, Allah be praised, I'm a Muslim, and I believe in jihad. Jihad is one of the elements of the faith, and this is what encouraged me to sacrifice Muhammad in jihad for the sake of Allah. Because I love my son, I encouraged him to die a martyr's death for the sake of Allah. Of course, this is a very different idea of martyrdom from the Christian idea, not the idea of sacrificing yourself for the faith, but of actually murdering other people for the sake of a wartime objective. But she goes on to say, there's no disagreement among scholars on such matters. This is an easy thing. And see, this is what I've come to say, not that all Muslims are terrorists, or all Muslims are evil, or that all Muslims are going to come and want to kill us, not in the slightest, but that Muslims every day are being taught from the Quran in this manner, and just simply to say, well, those are just the extremists and they're off in the corner, is to ignore the reality of the situation, that really the group that has the best claim to be the mainstream in Islam at this point is actually this group. The online magazine Al-Ansar, a columnist, wrote this, Allah told us of the certainty of the annihilation of the infidels. Now you note the religious language here. This is what I'm chiefly trying to point out. He's not saying that this is war, that we are suffering various economic or political injustices and so on. This is a religious struggle. He clarified that this would be achieved in one of two ways, by means of a direct act of Allah, or by means of the Muslim group, which would, in accordance with the Islamic commandment, serve as an implement for carrying out this divine decree. Quoting the Quran, Surah 9:52, Allah will torture the infidels himself or at our hands. So you have this in the book, and it's presented as a commandment. Whether or not, once again, whether or not it's strictly speaking by everyone's canons of interpretation, a legitimate interpretation of the verse, it's certainly an easy one and a widespread one. Sheikh Omar Bakri of Britain, who was he made the headlines for holding a rally last September 11th, 2002, in support of Al-Qaeda's actions on September 11th, 2001. He said, Allah willing, we will transform the West into Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam. Classic Islamic theology divides the world into two parts, the House of Islam, Dar al-Islam, and the Dar al-Harb, the House of War. And the House of War must always diminish before the House of Islam's advances, which can be by military force. Allah willing, we will transform the West into Dar al-Islam by means of invasion from without. If an Islamic state arises and invades the West, we will be its army and its soldiers from within. If not, we will change the West through ideological invasion from here, without war or killing. Now, the very interesting thing about Bakri is that they asked him then, he's a very fascinating character in many ways, and he's very clever. They asked him, how can you stay here as a British citizen and preach the destruction of the British state? And he says this, as long as my words do not become actions, they do no harm. Here, the law does not punish you for words, as long as there's no proof you've carried out actions. In such a case, you're still on the margins of the law, and they cannot punish you. If they want to punish you, they must present evidence against you. Otherwise, their laws will be in a state of internal contradiction. And he's absolutely right. How far can a tolerant state go tolerating a group that's determined to kill it? He goes on to say, then this will serve Islam, because we will be able to claim that the capitalist camp has failed in the face of the Islamic camp in actualizing the things in which it believes, freedom of expression. Either you have freedom of expression or you don't. But how much freedom of expression can you have when the people are expressing, we will kill you all, we will destroy this. Friday sermons from Saudi Arabia. Every Friday, good Muslims go to the mosque and they hear khutbah, the Friday sermon. And the imams who teach the Friday sermons in our ally Saudi Arabia had this to say recently. In Medina, one of the holy cities of Islam, Sheikh Abdulaziz Qadi said, two groups, the Jews and the Christians, are the main elements constituting the camp of kufr, unbelief, and will continue to be its two foundations until Allah allows their downfall and annihilation at the end of days. In conjunction with this, in a mosque in Mecca, another sheikh said, the call for the unification of religions, he was discussing the visit of the Pope to the mosque in Syria. They were very upset about that, and saying that they're trying to bring all these religions together. The call for the unification of religions will lead to presenting the infidel school of thought as correct, and to silence regarding them, to permitting conversion to Judaism and Christianity with no shame whatsoever. And I quote that because I wanted to point out that in classic Islamic law, once again, a convert from Islam to Christianity or to any other religion is under a death sentence. And this indicates that they take that very seriously. I know personally some very fine men who've converted from Islam to Christianity, and they have taken assumed names. They're not in particular danger here in the United States, at least we hope, but for the sake of their families, who are still Muslims in their home countries, they have to disassociate themselves from them. Because, once again, these things are not just laws on the books that everyone ignores. Would that were so. I mean, it would be better if they weren't even there. There can be, this is also the same sermon. This is more in service of the fact that we are dealing with a group of people that is not interested in coexistence. There can be neither an agreement nor a meeting point between the people of Islam and the Jewish and Christian people of the book. People of the book is the term used in the Quran for the Jews and the Christians primarily, also the Zoroastrians. How can we allow the Catholic popes talk of a need to find meeting points and agreement between Islam and Christianity so that there will be peaceful coexistence between the two religions and harmony between the two communities? If the infidels live among the Muslims, they have to live in accordance with the conditions set out by the Prophet. Now, this is also part of Islamic law and is an indication of people with a fundamentally different mindset from that which would allow for mutual tolerance and coexistence in a secular framework. He goes on to delineate these conditions. There's nothing wrong with it, provided they pay the jizya, the special tax on non-Muslims. Other conditions are that they do not renovate a church or a monastery, that they do not rebuild ones that were destroyed. So you can't build a new church or repair an old one, so you're in a perpetual state of decline. That they feed for 3 days any Muslim who passes by their homes, that they rise when a Muslim wishes to sit, that they do not imitate Muslims in dress or speech. That's an interesting one. It was actually, you hear a lot about the yellow star during World War II that the Jews were made to wear, not without making any connection between Islam and Nazis in any sense. It was actually the Islamic world that originated the idea of different dress for religious minorities in the Middle Ages in accordance with this provision. That they do not ride horses, nor own swords, nor arm themselves with any kind of weapon, that they do not sell wine, do not show the cross, do not ring church bells, do not raise their voices during prayer, that they shave their hair in front so as to make them easily identifiable, and that they do not incite anyone against these Muslims and do not strike a Muslim. If they violate these conditions, they have no protection. Now, I want to point out, I'm not reading to you, I could be reading to you some old law from the Middle Ages that's 1,000 years old and nobody's paid attention to. This was a sermon preached a couple weeks ago in Saudi Arabia, in our ally here. Also, these provisions appear pretty much exactly as they're laid out by this gentleman in this book, Reliance of the Traveler, which is a manual of Islamic law printed in Cairo at Al-Azhar University. Al-Azhar University is the oldest university in the world, and it has great prestige in the Islamic world. There's a very interesting story about this, as a matter of fact. Sheikh Mohammed Sayyid Tantawi is the Grand Sheikh of Al-Azhar University. Last year, I guess it's 2 years ago now, after September 11th, he said, terrorism is a disease and Islam forbids the killing of innocent civilians. The BBC quoted him in an article that called him the highest spiritual authority for the world's 1 billion Sunni Muslims. And George Bush went to the United Nations and quoted him. Then, the same Sheikh Tantawi, last spring, said he stirred up some trouble about the suicide bombings because he originally came out against them, and that again made the headlines. The New York Times did a long story on Al-Azhar. Moderate Muslims fear their messages being ignored, saying that Al-Azhar has sought to advise Muslims around the world that those who kill in the name of Islam are nothing more than heretics. It has sought to guide and to reassure Westerners against any clash of civilizations. It said, in conversations at the graceful Al-Azhar structure known as the House of the Sheikh, clerks sitting behind Arabic-style windows and elegant carvings have cast themselves again and again as the guides to a gentle Islam. Well, once again, in the interests of trying to point out the challenges that we face in the contemporary world, Sheikh Tantawi last spring reversed himself about the suicide bombings and said that the killing of women, children, and teenagers was in accordance with Islamic law and was actually the Islamic commandment. But then you didn't hear the BBC calling him the highest spiritual authority for the world's 1 billion Sunni Muslims, or the New York Times writing about how Al-Azhar is struggling to present a gentle Islam. But this makes the situation very difficult, because these are supposed to be the people who are on our side. This is the guy that George Bush quoted. But unfortunately, the situation is simply not that simple. A few more things that I need to point out. What I've just been telling you about Sheikh Tantawi and Al-Azhar, you should remember in light of talk about the Wahhabi movement in Saudi Arabia. You hear a lot about the Wahhabis, and there is a book out now, as a matter of fact, that argues that the Wahhabi movement is actually responsible for the extremism in Islam and has spread this extremism all over the world, but that actually they represent a tiny minority of Muslims. And if the Wahhabis were stamped out, they're the regime in control of Saudi Arabia, then presumably our troubles would be over. But what I just quoted to you about Al-Azhar has nothing to do with the Wahhabis. Sheikh Muhammad Sayyid Tantawi is not a Wahhabi, and the people who produced this book are not Wahhabis. This book has in it instructions about jihad and about waging war against non-Muslims, quoting the Prophet Muhammad, "I have been commanded to fight people until they testify that there is no God but Allah, and that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. Perform the prayer and pay zakat," that's paying alms. "If they say it, they have saved their blood and possessions from me, except for the rights of Islam over them." So in other words, if they don't say it, they haven't saved their blood and possessions from him. But the point is that this is not a book produced by a lunatic fringe. This book is produced by the oldest Islamic university in the world, by a tremendously respected organization, and it also carries endorsements from the president of the International Institute of Islamic Thought, from the Grand Mufti of the Jordanian Armed Forces, and from the Grand Imam of the Mosque of Darwish Pasha in Damascus. So you have Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. And then it begins to look like, well, if these people are lining up against this, then who's the mainstream and who's the fringe? Another Saudi preacher, a couple Fridays ago, Sheikh Muhammad Saleh al-Munajid, said, Muslims must educate their children to jihad. This is the greatest benefit of today's situation, educating the children to jihad and to hatred of Jews, Christians, and infidels. All right? Same thing. Speaking about the Jews, Sheikh Sultan al-Duwaid, another mosque in Saudi Arabia, calls them brothers of apes and pigs. Now that's nasty language, right? But he's actually referring to the second surah of the Koran, verse 65, which says that Allah changed the Jews into detested apes. And so these brothers of apes and pigs are tormenting 1 billion Muslims. There's no other way, O Muslims, but restoring the missing precept, jihad for the sake of Allah. There's no other way but educating to jihad. Now, it is also a fact that the Saudi imams who preach this are part of a government structure, while ostensibly our ally is the primary financier of mosques in the United States. And so, are we to believe that if the money trail is going in this direction, that none of the ideas are also following? Are we to believe that that the ordinary good American Muslim who wants to be a good American and so on, that George Bush invoked, and there are many. The problem is, are we to believe that he's going to go into his mosque on Friday and not hear this same kind of thing? Certainly won't hear it everywhere, but if the money is all coming from the people who are saying this, why are they going to say anything different? Now, the struggle really nowadays is against secularism versus Islam, because the West is not really presenting a religious alternative or spiritual alternative to the Islamic challenge, although this might be actually what's called for ultimately, that the West needs to recover its own spiritual resources. And I would certainly think that that's the case. But at this point, it's really a struggle between consumerism and Islam, or secularism, secular materialism, and Islam. And so, for example, you have, in 1987, an American journalist, Charles Glass, decided to walk from Turkey to Egypt. It might not have been very wise, and sure enough, in Lebanon, he was kidnapped by the Hezbollah and held as a hostage. Now, he found that his captors, while he's being held there as a hostage, are dedicated to destroying the West and destroying American values, destroying, in other words, secularism and materialism, and they're listening to Madonna records. You know, while they're holding a gun on him and ready to kill him if he moves. And they ask him things like, do you think American girls would find me attractive? And yet, at the same time, it doesn't stop them from acting in this regard, in this manner. And the point is that while the attraction of secularism is undeniable and true, and there is no doubt a tremendous ambivalence in the Islamic world as to how to respond to it, and that attraction is felt there, at the same time it would be naive in the extreme to think that it's going to completely overcome these religious impulses that are coming from the core Islamic materials. It would be naive to think that because you give people some money or McDonald's or something that they'll be happy and they'll stop. This is, well, as it has been termed by other people, a clash of civilizations, whether we really like it or not, or whether we want to fight or not, because what we have here is a large and growing group of people who consider that that's exactly what it is. I will close up to take some questions, but I wanted to point out one last thing, and that is that we are probably numerically talking about a small group of people within the Muslim world, maybe 10%, 15%, who believe that it's part of their religious responsibility to wage war against non-Muslim elements. However, that's 150 million people right there. But also because they are winning the debate about how to interpret the Quran and the violent verses that I quoted at the beginning, they are extremely formidable and liable to be growing. I can give you an example that's actually a 100-year-old example, and I chose it precisely because it's 100 years old to indicate that this state of affairs is nothing new. That there can be people who live quiet lives and peaceful lives, and they just want to be left alone. But then there are some of them who, at a certain point in their life, might think, I want to be more serious about my religion, and then they are vulnerable, if they are Muslims, to this kind of exegesis, and always have been. The story comes from Turkey, where, in accordance with long-standing practice, whenever there was a period of political or social upheaval, the leaders would generally tend to become more Islamic. That what we need to solve this problem is to get back to pleasing God, and so we need to become more genuinely Islamic and more strict about our religion. And that's when episodes like this happen. This is an old woman recounting what happened. She said, "One night my husband came home and told me that the Padishah had sent word that we were to kill all the Christians in the village and that we would have to kill our neighbors." Now, you can imagine that the Padishah is saying something as outrageous as that. He's able to get the point across by appealing to the kinds of verses in the Koran that I quoted earlier. I was very angry and told him that I did not care who gave such orders. They were wrong. These neighbors had always been very kind to us, and if he dared to kill them, Allah would pay us out. I tried all I could to stop him, but he killed them with his own hand. Now, this is not to say, once again, that everyone is likely to become a killer, but only that the challenge that the moderate Muslims in the world face, as well as in the United States, is to formulate an explanation of the Quran and of the Sunnah of the Prophet, the traditions about the Prophet Muhammad, that defangs the violence in it, that declaws the book, that makes it so that when the extremists say what we have to do is kill these people because this is what the Quran says, they say, no, you're misreading it, and here's why, and this is an argument that they will find compelling. They're not doing it. And I'm not sure that it can be done. I hope that it can be done, certainly. But this is the challenge. And once again, the reason why it's important for us to know it is so that, very simply, so that we know what we're up against. You remember the movie Patton? And how Patton beat Rommel, the German general, because he read his book on military tactics. And so because he read the book, he knew what Rommel was going to do. So then when Rommel did it, he was ready, and he beat him. He read his book. The problem that we have in the United States is that we're not reading the Muslim book par excellence, the Quran, or listening to what Muslims themselves are saying. And the formulation that there's moderate Islam and extremist Islam, and they're two widely divergent things, and never the twain shall meet, and so on, and that extremist Islam is a patent misuse of the texts. Well, that's very nice, but does it really tally with what the Muslims are saying? So, I see that we've come to 4:45, and thank you very much. And does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
Suggestion. I hear the problem.
Yes.
I think most everybody in the room is going to agree with it.
Uh-huh.
But what do we have to look forward to as a measure of solution?
Realism.
Well,
courage.
Even though we understand it, even when
Yes.
we accept it as real, what can we do about it?
Okay, well, I'll give you two things. One of them's already being done, although it's probably not being done as much as it should be, and the other one is not being done at all. The first one is this. The mosques, in a great degree, in the United States, are locations of sedition. They are religious gathering places, but they are also places where people are plotting to destroy the United States. Now, nobody wants to say that, and everyone is shocked because it's a religious place, and we don't talk about religious places like that. But I quoted you what they're saying. I didn't make this stuff up. You can go and look it up yourself, and it's in there. And there's plenty more of it, too. Now, the point is that if there's an organization in the country that you know is plotting to destroy the government as a whole and to kill millions of people, then is it really realistic to say, well, we have to allow these people freedom of religion, and so we can't go into those places and listen to what's going on? I mean, I'm all for freedom of religion, and I certainly am not advocating violating anyone's civil rights, but I think we can go a long way toward monitoring what's happening in the mosques, and this has actually been enabled by the Patriot Act to some degree, so that we can at least pay attention to what's happening there, and that has to be done.
We ought to populate those mosques with some of our tried and true.
Yes, definitely. No doubt about that. Secondly, I just flew in this morning. So I was standing in the line, and there was this very nice lady in front of me, and they called her out and searched her baggage. Now, how many of you think she might have had a bomb? And, you know, I've been doing a lot of traveling lately, and I've seen grandmothers in wheelchairs and the most appalling things, and they're getting searched. And the problem is that everybody's afraid of being called a racist. And so that if you say, well, all the terrorists, 100% of the terrorists are young Muslim males, and so maybe we should just be a little more careful about young Muslim males, well, then you're a racist. Well, is it, okay, I love everybody, but is it, if I know that there's a group of people that wants to kill me, well, then maybe I'll risk being called a racist and say we need to investigate them. And, you know, this is called profiling and so on. And yes, innocent people will be inconvenienced. And I've been inconvenienced. You know, a lot of people have said to me, you know, you look like a Muslim, yes. And I don't mind. If they want to search me every time and take off my socks and shoes and necktie and everything, fine. I don't mind, because I know what we're up against. But nobody has the courage to do that, because the fundamental evil in the world is racism, not terrorism. And as long as the fundamental evil in the world remains racism, and not that people are trying to kill us, then we're all going to just get killed. But you understand, I'm not advocating racism. It's just people can't be realistic about that issue anymore. Yes, sir.
I don't understand why we don't hear more of this information from other sources. I was listening to C-SPAN the other day, and Emerson was talking about American Jihad, his book. And he was telling things like what you're telling, and saying that he's been boycotted by PBS ever since. He's never been allowed back.
Well, I've never even been invited.
What's wrong with our public broadcasting systems? What's wrong with our news? They're afraid to tell the truth.
Yes, because they'll be called racist.
It's totally scary.
But see, I'm not even talking about a race.
First line of defense is our news, and we're getting the news.
I mean, see, it's absurd on the face of it, because the Muslims are not one race. It's racist to call racism when you're talking about Islam, because Islam is a multicultural, multinational entity. And there's not any one race that it involves. I mean, actually, that makes the airport thing difficult, because young Muslim males don't actually all look the same. But certainly, you can keep a realistic eye out for people. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, you said somewhere in your talk, which has been wonderful, and I thank you.
Thank you.
That you think that perhaps we should be moving in the direction of using our spiritual resources in the response. Can you say more about that?
I would love to. Thank you. I'll give you an example. Nigeria. Islamic religious law stipulates that there has to be, to prove rape or adultery, 4 male witnesses who saw the act. The woman's word does not count in those cases. So if a woman is raped, and she goes to the authorities and says, I was raped, worthless, means nothing. 4 male witnesses who saw the act. Now, how often are you going to have 4 male witnesses who saw a rape? All right, so the whole thing is absurd, but it comes from the thing, see, this is what we're up against, again, is that the life of the Prophet Muhammad is considered normative. He is the model for all human behavior. And he is, I don't agree with Jerry Falwell that he was a terrorist, but I believe that he was a 7th century man and a 7th century warrior. And he lived his life in a 7th century way, and 7th century was a brutal time. And to canonize that and say this is the model for all human behavior is to canonize that brutality. So look, Muhammad had a favorite wife, Aisha. She was accused of adultery, but Allah came to his rescue, as he did many times, with a revelation that said, have they produced 4 male witnesses? If not, it's they who are the liars. That's in the Quran. Ever since then, you have to have the 4 male witnesses to prove these sexual infidelities. Now, or rape. Now, this is the problem with it. Nigeria. 2 cases recently. You have women who were raped, but they don't have the 4 male witnesses, of course, and they conceive a child. The child then becomes evidence of their guilt. They're not married, so they've committed adultery. Penalty? Death by stoning. Their word is worthless. The man they accuse denies it, and so that's good enough, and there are no 4 witnesses. Now, Sufiyatu Husseini was one of these women in Nigeria. She was sentenced to death by stoning. And there was an international outcry, and thank God, ultimately the international pressure prevailed, and she was exonerated. But there were a lot of Muslims who were very upset about that, because they were following, and the Attorney General in Nigeria said, we're following the law of Allah, so we're not going wrong. But anyway, look, the Archbishop of Lagos, Nigeria, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Lagos, offered to the Muslims, "Stone me in her place." Now, there is a sharp distinction between Christianity and Islam. And I'll never get on PBS Now, because to say something nice about Christianity is even worse. But the fact is that there are significant differences between Christianity and Islam and their fundamental attitudes towards human life. And one of them is a religion of purity and law and justice, as they see it, and the other is mercy and self-sacrifice. Now, I believe that it's only by actualizing that mercy and self-sacrifice that we're ever going to really prevail against this challenge. Yes, sir.
The purported failure of secular Arabism or nationalism from the 50s, 60s, 70s onward, could that have any role in the present day in the supposed upsurge of militant Islam, or has that always been below the surface?
It failed because of the upsurge. The failure was caused by the upsurge. And the people who were upsurging wanted very much to bring about the failure. Because Islam is a total way of life. It is not just an individual faith. It's never been conceived as such. As a matter of fact, if you look at the Muslim calendar, the year 1, what is it? It is not when Muhammad was born. It is not when he got his first revelation or anything else that we might expect. It's what?
It's the Exodus from Medina.
Well, it's more importantly about that. It's the flight from Medina, but the reason why that's considered the year 1 is because it is the first time, I don't want to take all the time to recount the history of it, but in short, it is when Muhammad became for the first time the leader of a political community, a head of state and a head of an army, as well as just a preacher. That's the year 1, because Islam is not just an individual faith, but a political and a social system. Secularism is an imported Western idea, and there have been it was imported by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk into Turkey, and he made war on the Muslims, and they hate him still. In the videotape that of the Saudi sheikh who went to see Osama bin Laden after September 11th, they mention infidels like the Turks. The secular model in the Islamic world has always been under pressure from Muslims who consider that any government that's not based on Islamic law is illegitimate.
Does not have any favor in...
It has some favor, but even in Turkey it's under pressure, and they're having to make more and more concessions to the people who advocate Islamic law. Now the problem there is that any secular government, Saddam Hussein, Egypt, any secular government in the Islamic world has always been, and I think will always be, under pressure from these Islamic groups who consider it illegitimate. And so, you know, you're talking about war on Iraq, and George Bush and Condoleezza Rice are going to put a democracy in Iraq, but they're not considering, I don't think, whether the Iraqis really want a democracy, or whether any democracy, especially one that's established by the United States, is going to have any appeal or any traction in a society where most people think that a government is only legitimate if it flows from religious principles. And so I think the failure of secular Islam, to get back to your question, came about because there are so many Muslims who reject the very idea of secularism. And this, again, is part of what we have to face realistically, that not everybody in the world really does long for democracy. Yes, sir?
You said that in the West that the struggle is between materialistic secularism and
Yes.
Islam.
That's how it is, not necessarily how it should be.
Okay. Well, it doesn't seem to me that materialistic secularism has the ideological vigor to withstand an Islamic onslaught.
I think you're absolutely
I don't
right.
know what our prospects will be.
Well, look at this. Look, go on Amazon.com and look at my book and see all the people calling me names. Read the book and see if there's anything in there except what Muslims are saying. So really they should be calling the Muslims names, not me. But the point is that anybody who dares to quote these things that are outside the secular multicultural tolerance paradigm, well...
Things like our model of pluralism has a death wish.
Yes. Well, that's what Bakri said, Sheikh Omar Bakri in Britain, that they say they're for freedom of expression. Well, I'm testing it out. And see, pluralism does, yeah, that's absolutely true. Pluralism has a death wish, because how pluralistic are you going to be? Are you going to be pluralistic to the guy who's holding a knife to your throat? Where does it end? You're going to be willing to make the hard choices and say, we have to act differently toward this group. Well, I don't know that we have the energy to do that anymore, because then we'd be racists. Not really. I mean, racism, really, what is racism? It's taking people of a particular race and causing them harm or behaving badly toward them because they belong to a particular race. Now, is anything like what I'm saying, does that have anything to do with it? Not I think, in any fair person's mind or any realistic person's mind, but that's, these things just all fall into these categories automatically. Such is the state of American political discourse today. Yes, sir.
Seems to me that this crisis should bring us to grips with the real issue, which is the religions of the world are based on imaginations of human beings. And this Allah, who doesn't exist, and God, who, well, we don't know whether a God or whatever exists, but, you know, there are our imaginations. We need to bring this to a head and be realistic about it.
Well,
and
yeah.
the only way we can convince the Muslims is we need to find a way to convince them, hey, this Allah guy you belong to, you believe in, is a figment of our imaginations.
Well, you know,
of your imaginations.
There are two things that I can comment about that. Thank you. One is that that's really what I was saying before, that the Archbishop of Lagos did by offering to be stoned in the place of the woman who was accused of adultery. That there he is really bringing to life the difference between Christianity and Islam and showing that there is a better way to behave.
Well, in order for us to say that Allah is created by humans, we have to accept that also this idea of God is also created by humans.
Well, I don't know about that, but in any case...
Well, that's the reality.
Huh?
That's the reality.
Not everyone will agree with you.
No, not everyone will agree with me, but that's not really what we're discussing here today. The other thing was that there's a Hindu spokesman who said, when he read the Quran, he said, I can't tell the difference between its God and its devil. And that's very hard to get anyone who's within the Islamic system to face up to, but there's plenty of reasons why he would say that. Like, for example, in the Quran, Allah says, if I had wished, I would have guided everyone to the truth. But I decided not to. And so he's going to send these people to this terrible, lurid hell, which is described in there, simply on a whim, basically, because he chose not to guide everyone to the truth. And, well, these are the kinds of internal contradictions and pressures that the thing is operating under. But the problem is that there's no self-criticism within the Islamic world that allows these things to be looked at critically. For example, Suleiman Bashir is a scholar in the West Bank, and he was teaching in his classes that the Quran was the product of historical development, and thus man-made and not dropped from heaven, and they threw him out the window, his students. I guess they would have given his class a poor evaluation. Yes, sir?
There appears to be a lot of support for the regime in Iraq in the Islamic world.
Yes.
Iraq is a secular country.
Yes, it is.
What is, other than oil, what is the basis of the Islamic support?
Saddam Hussein is a very intelligent man, and before the first Gulf War, he began to become a much better Muslim, and to frame the terms of the debate in Islamic religious terms, so that he was able to appeal to the sizable religious contingent, the hardcore Muslims in his country, and say, I'm the defender of Islam. And so you might not like me, but you have to support me in this, because in the Muslim world there's a very strong tradition of very great strife among themselves, but against an external enemy they'll always unite. Yes, ma'am.
That the driving force behind Islam isn't really maybe the fervor of their religious beliefs, but really just the drive for power or for control. because even, you know, just their treatment of women, it's just that they have got to maintain ultimate control of what people think, what people do, what clothes they wear, what food they eat.
Well, that's a religious impulse. Islam is an incredibly detailed religion of laws. This is a book of laws about the clothes you should wear, the food you should eat, and how you should treat your wife, and so on. And, you know, as far as treating women goes, the Quran says in Surah 434, good women are obedient. As for those that are not, admonish them, send them to separate beds, and beat them. And so, you know, I was talking to a very nice Muslim lady a few weeks ago, and she said, oh, but you're taking that out of context. My imam, the great Siddiqui in California, said that that's no longer operative and we don't beat our wives. But I was looking at this translation that comes straight from Saudi Arabia, and it footnotes that verse, and it says, only as a last resort. It doesn't say don't beat them. And so the point is that, once again, there's not any one single voice speaking in this religion, and the nature of the book is such that these violent elements are always going to be there. Because even if it is just a will to power, it is firmly rooted in and justified by the book, the Quran. And so until there's a wholesale reevaluation of the Quran, we're going to be up against this problem. Yes, sir.
I have a son in college, and I followed the story about the UNC,
Yes.
had to read that book. And I've also been following a story about Campus Watch by Daniel Pipes, who's identified what he considers a bias in Middle Eastern studies.
Yes.
Can you comment on those subjects? Or?
Sure. I don't know that I would be able to say anything about the North Carolina case that you haven't already heard, but the thing that most concerns me about it, as you probably already know, the translation of the Quran that was chosen for this course was only the early revelations. When I first started reading the Quran, over 20 years ago, when I was at the University of North Carolina, although it wasn't an assignment, I was just reading it because I was interested, I was entranced by the early revelations. I don't think there's any point in making any secret about that there's a lot of beautiful things in there. Very appealing things. It's only when you get to the early revelations, by the way, are in the back of the book, if you read the Quran, because they put it's arranged from the longest to the shortest chapters, and the early revelations are all pretty short. Anyway, it's only when you get to the later ones, which were written when after Muhammad's initial message was rejected, that you start to get into these really disquieting passages, such as the ones I quoted and many others. And that being the case, to only give people the early ones is to give them the most attractive possible representation of Islam. And so what's going to be the result? I mean, we need to be realistic about this. Christianity and the traditional religions of the West, Judaism, are being rejected and ridiculed and discredited in the media all the time, and then they get this. Well, isn't it going to be appealing to anyone? And so is the Chapel Hill faculty promoting the establishment of a religion? Well, I think you can make a case for it, certainly. And what was the other one, the bias?
Thing. Have you heard that?
What in particular about it?
Well, he feels that the Middle Eastern studies academic programs have been hijacked by people with one
Oh,
view.
yeah, no doubt about it.
And so he set up a website that identifies actions or you know, people who have done what he thinks are very biased
yes,
talks or whatever.
Well, I just don't think there's any doubt about that. That all you have to do is, well, for example, one of the reviews of my own book in a Canadian newspaper said, in between calling me a hate monger and such, said, why is it that the lie that violence is part of Islam has gained such traction? They don't support that it's a lie. They don't give any reason to think that it's a lie. They don't address any of the things that I've just given you to show that it might not be a lie, but they just call me names and say it's a lie. And I think, well, that's pretty much par for the course from what you're going to get from most media outlets today. And that's primarily because the idea of multiculturalism and tolerance and absolute relativism, as paradoxical as that may be, holds sway, so that you can criticize the West and the Western religious tradition as much as you want, but you cannot say a word negative about anybody else's, even if they're saying it. Yes, sir.
Financial angle, it counts a great deal more than we've been talking about. I mean, should we go on holding our noses and doing business with the Saudis? Why would it not have been better had a secular Saddam Hussein taken over that entire area? Let them do business with a secular controller instead of with a religious controller.
It's a good question. And there's also the question of the Alaskan oil reserves and the role that they could possibly play in lessening the dependence on Middle Eastern oil. And the Russians. Yes, sir.
About that tax you spoke about.
The jizya.
Yeah. How's it collected?
Well, it's not really, it's advocated nowadays by these groups that are trying to restore the purity of Islam in the Islamic states. I don't think that it is actually on the books in any Islamic state today. It is? Yemen, of course. I should have known it would be Yemen. Thank you. Anyway.
One of your children contributed that instead of the tax.
Oh, well, that's a historical fact. In the Turkish Empire, as well as in the early Islamic empires that came up out of Arabia, the tax was so prohibitive that, as the gentleman pointed out over here, sometimes people had to actually give their children as slaves to pay the rate of the tax. The tax actually is based on the verse in the Koran that I quoted earlier that says, until they pay the tax and are utterly subdued. Working from that utterly subdued, the Islamic authorities elaborated a series of laws that were designed to humiliate the Jews and the Christians, so that when the tax was collected, the Islamic magistrate was instructed in some places actually to yell at them and say, "Pay the jizya," and then to hit them on the back of the head. And the ritual blow on the back of the head was part of what you had to do to pay your taxes. You couldn't just fill out a 1040 and send it in. Also, interestingly enough, the tax rate was so high for Jews and Christians that the Jews and Christians effectively financed the expansion of the early Islamic empires, such that their own condition was so miserable that a lot of them, simply to try to make some kind of a better life for themselves, wanted to convert to Islam. Excuse me, and many did. But a lot of times they were actually prevented from converting because too many converts would destroy the tax base. These are elements of history. Then you can look them up, but you don't hear them on in the media these days. You only hear about the Crusades, which actually started 300 years after the Islamic armies started to press into Christian areas, and ended, 300 years before, rather. Let me say that again. The jihads started 300 years before there was ever a crusade, and overwhelmed the historically Christian areas of North Africa and the Middle East. And they didn't end until 400 years after the last crusade. So you hear about the Crusades provoked this hostility between Muslims and Christians. Well, actually, the hostility was provoked by Muslims, and many years before there was ever a crusade. These are simply matters of fact. Why they're being glossed over or outright denied is, well, it's an interesting question, but it's nonetheless a fact.
You're not saying that there weren't some horrible things that went on from the Western...
No, I'm not saying that. There were.
During the Crusades.
There were horrible things, yes. The only saying that the that the hostilities stemmed from the Islamic theology that I quoted, that Muhammad said, "I've been commanded to fight against people until they confess that there's no God but Allah and that I'm his messenger." That those hostilities commenced long before there was ever a response from the Christian world. That 300 years afterward, the Christian world did respond with the Crusades, that the Crusades went wrong in many ways. It might not have been the right response in the first place, but that the jihads continued. And most importantly of all, the theology of jihad has never been repudiated. The Pope has apologized for the Crusades. Protestant groups have apologized for the Crusades. Nobody upholds the theology of the Crusades today, but the theology of jihad is still part of Islamic law. And it is still considered part of the collective responsibility of the Ummah, of the Muslim worldwide community, to make war against non-Muslims until they convert or are subdued. Now, that's not to say that all Muslims think that's what they ought to be doing, but we would be naive if we thought that that meant that no Muslims thought that's what they ought to be doing.
Where are you getting the Friday sermons from? When you're
Memory, memory.org, M-E-M-R-I, and there's plenty more there. Yes, sir.
This is just a continuation of what you were just saying. How is jihad defined? You know, we have some people saying it's the whole group has to convert or whatever.
Yeah.
Other people say it's a personal jihad.
Yeah.
What is the traditional interpretation of what jihad means?
The people who say that it's a personal thing are right, but they're only half right because they're only telling you the half truth. The jihad in Islamic theology is divided into two parts, the greater jihad and the lesser jihad. The greater jihad is the internal spiritual struggle of every believer to conform his life to the will of Allah. And so he gets rid of the sins in his soul, and he stops his behavior that's offensive to God, and he gets with it. That's the greater jihad. A lot of times now I have heard Muslim groups today say, see, jihad doesn't mean holy war, it just means fighting against sin. Well, yes, but there's also the lesser jihad. And the lesser jihad does involve the use of force. Historically, the caliph was the only one who could wage a jihad. The caliph was the successor of the Prophet Muhammad and the leader of the Islamic community. However, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the secular ruler of Turkey, abolished the caliphate in 1924, and there hasn't been a caliph since then. There's tremendous debate nowadays as to whether that means that there can be no jihad, or whether anybody can call a jihad, and if so, whom? And Osama bin Laden took it upon himself to declare one. Other people say he can't do that. Other people follow him. And there have been other people who say that it's within the right of an Islamic ruler, like Saddam, to call a jihad. And as a matter of fact, he threatened to, not long ago. Said that if the American army invades, he will call a jihad, and that would mean he would be calling upon the support of Muslims from outside of Iraq to fight.
One more.
Yes, ma'am.
What it all seems to come down to is a psychopathic death cult. And they're halfway there by denying the humanity of women.
Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say they deny the humanity of women, but certainly they are very clear in the Quran that men are superior to women, with statements that are much stronger than anything you find in the Older New Testament. But as far as the death cult goes, you remind me of Osama bin Laden saying, we love death as much as the Westerners love life, and therefore we will win, we will defeat them. Now, what's interesting about that is that he didn't make that up. That's a very snappy little phrase, but that's something that you find actually in Islamic history, that often the warriors of jihad have said, we love death, and therefore we will win, because the Quran says that if you fight and die in the cause of Allah, you'll go straight to paradise, and you know, with the virgins and so on. And so these lovers of death then go out and they wage these wars with incredible courage, because they win either way. Yes?
Out of the Old Testament.
Out of the Old Testament?
The way they treated women then. And
well, yeah, the Quran in many cases is similar to the Old Testament, and even depends textually not on the text of the Old Testament, but Muhammad was retailing stories from the Old Testament and from Jewish tradition. The problem, once again, is that while Judaism and Christianity have been able to develop because of the strong teachings about the equality of rights of every human being before God, Islam has never been able to, because of the idea of the Quran as being dictated by God. It doesn't allow for because there's no slippage, there's no traction, there's no development, because it's all what God said. And so Jesus came along and said, you've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist one who is evil, but turn the other cheek. Whereas in Islam, there's all this single message of be merciful to one another, but ruthless to unbelievers, and so on, and it's all God's eternal word. It's as relevant now as it was when it was written.
this Jesus. He came along preaching and practicing the feminine virtues of kindness, decency, honesty, and all that jazz.
Kindness, decency, and honesty, absolutely. I certainly think that that's part of the solution here, that if people have the courage, it takes a great deal more courage to live that way than to respond with violence. And if people have the courage to respond that way in a large enough group, then maybe we'll be able to make some traction here. Well, thank you very much.
I want to thank him so much for taking your time out of your busy schedule to talk to us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Interesting. Thank you again for coming. If you'd like to have your book signed or come and chat with Mr. Spencer, he will be here at the table to receive you. And again, thank you.
Robert Spencer is a board member of the Christian Islamic Forum. Islam Unveiled, Disturbing Questions About the World's Fastest Growing Faith, is published by Encounter Books on the web at encounterbooks.com. You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN2, 48 hours of nonfiction books. Coming up at 11 a.m. Eastern, Encore Book Notes with Laura Claridge, author of Norman Rockwell, A Life. Then In Depth with Bob Woodward is live. Join us for 3 hours as we discuss the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist's complete body of work and take your phone calls and emails. Later today on Book TV, Philip Melanson, author of The Secret Service, The Hidden History of an Enigmatic Agency. After that, Jeff Shera turns his historical fiction series from the Civil War to the American Revolution with his new book, The Glorious Cause. And later, The Mississippi and the Making of a Nation, Douglas Brinkley's profile of the Louisiana Purchase